Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. I have a reading today, and our theme this Sunday is the winter solstice, which, from your perspective, will be happening tomorrow, the longest night of the year. This is an excerpt from a book by Barbara Brown Taylor called Learning to Walk in the Dark. And she writes, I cannot remember the last time I heard anyone use dark to describe something good. Fear of the dark has been sanctified in so many people's minds that I have to define my terms, not once, but over and over again. Because without constant reminders that darkness is not a synonym for mortal or spiritual danger, most people I know revert to the equation without even thinking about it. It is as if they have a default setting for darkness in their minds that automatically resets every time the sun comes up. In the full light of day, darkness becomes the most convenient place for them to store all their shadows, their fear of the unknown, their anxiety about the future, their loathing of their own helplessness, their bottomless dread of death. If darkness really does bring such phantoms out of hiding, I think that is because the bright distractions of daytime have come to their natural end. When the sun goes down, it is time for another natural thing to happen, as the slower, quieter, and more tactile rhythms of nighttime open doors that remain shut during the day. No doubt there are frightening things behind some of those doors. But there are also stunning things. Eventually, what's in practice, one learns that all these doors open on the same room. To be human is to live by sunlight and moonlight, with anxiety and delight, admitting limits and transcending them, falling down and rising up. To want a life with only half of these things in it is to want half a life, shutting the other half away where it will not interfere with one's bright fantasies of the way things ought to be. Let us now share a moment of silence where we listen to the wisdom of our hearts and minds. Today's sermon is called Endarkenment, as opposed to Enlightenment, and it's the second of a two-part series on light and darkness. Part one was a couple of weeks ago, but don't worry, you didn't have to hear that one in order to appreciate this one. Most of us suffer from at least mild nyctophobia, a fear of the dark. It's almost part of our DNA as human beings. Darkness is a place where bad things happen. Many of the world's cultures associate light with goodness, intelligence, and love. In contrast, darkness is often associated with evil, ignorance, and fear. It's even a part of our language. For example, we say that a smart person is bright, while someone who isn't so smart is dim. We talk about being in a dark mood when we are angry, sad, or depressed. Centuries of folklore have taught us that all sorts of wicked things live in the dark. In religious circles, God and angels are beings of light, while the devil is known as the prince of darkness. We often go to great lengths to dispel the darkness, trying to act like it isn't there, or that with the flick of a light switch, we can banish it. But darkness is always with us. We never skip the night. The question is, are we doing ourselves a disservice by trying to focus only on the light? I came across this book a few years ago, Learning to Walk in the Dark by Barbara Brown Taylor, the excerpt I shared earlier. She is a progressive Episcopal minister who spent some time exploring the spiritual values of darkness and wrote that book to share her experiences and observations. We are taught to fear the dark when we are children. Our parents line our rooms and hallways with night lights to keep the boogeyman and other imagined monsters at bay. As we get older, darkness takes other forms, perhaps depression, loss, suffering, or fear. A loved one may be facing a terrible illness or an addiction, or the loss of a job. Innocents die in senseless acts of violence. We fight wars. The financial security of millions is threatened by the selfish greed of hundreds. Sooner or later, we will all have to face the end of our lives, and we can't help but worry and wonder about what that will be like. We don't like to think about it, but those of us who believe in God have all had moments where we have wondered, is our belief justified? And we go to great lengths to shut out the darkness. We put lights in all the rooms of our homes. Our eyes are glued to televisions, computers, or cell phones. Paradoxically, all of this light interferes with the natural rhythm of our bodies, making it harder for us to fall asleep or to stay asleep. At these times, we are left with nothing to do but lie in our beds, staring into the dark of night, alone with our racing, worrisome thoughts. It wasn't always this way, of course. In terms of human history, electric lights are a relatively recent invention. Never before had we been able to hold back the darkness to such a degree. But prior to that, people had little choice but to learn to live with the dark. Today, we think of at least 7 hours of sleep as being the ideal. But in the days of candlelight, our ancestors were much more attuned to the cycles of the days and the seasons. For example, in the winter months, they had to live their lives around the reality of nearly 14 hours of darkness. Researchers at the National Institute of Mental Health studied this phenomenon. They gathered a group of individuals and had them live in situations much like our ancestors, following the lighting of the day with no artificial lights. At first, the people slept for 11-hour stretches. Then they settled into a routine of 8 hours, but the hours were not consecutive. As time went on, the subjects in the study would have periods where they were neither actively awake nor soundly asleep. And scientists were fascinated to discover that this resulted in several new states of consciousness. States that most of us have lost by living in a world where we have much more control of when it gets dark in our homes. If we look back only 3 or 4 generations, our ancestors had to live with the realities of that darker world. And I think that part of the reason why we tend to shy away from the dark is that we just plain don't like it. It's uncomfortable. It's hard to find one's way in it. And it doesn't help that our culture tends to have a low tolerance for things that darken our spirits. We are encouraged to try to keep things positive, to have our moment of sadness or despair and then get over it, to move on with our lives. Plenty of churches offer a steady diet of sunshine spirituality, whereby if you stay positive and think good thoughts and have a strong faith, your life will always be full of light. Unfortunately, such churches also tend to send the message that if you suffer the effects of darkness, well, then your belief and your faith must not be strong enough. So, how does one learn to walk in the dark? Well, like anything else, it takes practice. First, we have to adjust our thinking. We need to let go of the notion that light automatically means good and darkness means bad. Instead, it helps to think of them as complements to one another, much in the same way that darkness gradually gives way to dawn and day in turn gives way to dusk and then night. There is nothing inherently good or evil in these occurrences. They simply are. And once we let go of the idea that darkness is bad, we can start small. We can begin with physical darkness. Go outside or sit inside without turning on any lights and watch out the window as night comes on. Appreciate the cycle of day giving way to night and the fact that the night isn't bad, it's just dark. When weather permits, take a walk in the dark. We rely so much on our sense of sight that we often neglect our other senses. How does darkness feel? What sounds and smells do we notice when our sight is reduced? Another thing you can do is to meditate in a dark closet or room, or skip the night lights when we've settled into bed. And what about spiritual darkness? How do we walk, metaphorically speaking, through that? Well, first we need to have acceptance. We need to accept that when we don't know, or what we don't know about God or the nature of reality is far greater than what we do know. We need to learn how to be okay with ambiguity. We need to accept that sometimes bad things happen just because. They are not punishments that we somehow deserve. Everything happens for a reason, yes, but not necessarily a purpose. And it helps to keep that in mind. The Buddhist nun and author Pema Chodron tells us that we are all so busy trying to build walls of protection against the darkness in our lives, walls that are incidentally always cracking and breaking down, that we scarcely notice where our suffering is really coming from. Our tendency is to think that our problems are out there in the dark. Dark nights, dark thoughts, dark emotions. If we could only protect ourselves better against such things, we think, we would surely feel more safe and secure. Of course, our experiences show us again and again that this is a false belief. The real problem, Chodron goes on to say, has far less to do with what is out there in the dark than it is our resistance to discovering what is really out there. Our suffering comes not so much from the darkness, but rather from our resistance to learning to navigate it. The more we practice accepting and moving through the dark, the more we come to realize that it is just like when we were kids and we feared all sorts of boogeymen and monsters that were lurking under our beds or hiding in our closets. It wasn't pleasant having those ideas running around in our heads, but in retrospect, they weren't really there, and we all survived it. The things that went bump in the night were not nearly as fearsome as we made them out to be. But we could only discover that through facing them. I mentioned earlier that we can help ourselves by letting go of the notion that darkness means something bad. The truth is that a lot of good things come out of the dark. We form in the darkness of our mother's wombs. Seeds first stir in the darkness of the soil. We see examples in the world's religions. In the Judeo-Christian scriptures, we have the story of Jacob, who wrestled with God all night and earned his blessing and a new name, Israel. Moses is said to have spoken with God directly on Mount Sinai, often at night. In the New Testament of the Bible, Jesus is born at night in a dark manger. Early Christian accounts refer to this as a cave as opposed to some sort of barn. Jesus' resurrection takes place in the darkness of a tomb. The Apostle Paul was struck blind, a personal darkness, before he had a change of heart and began his ministry. The Buddha found enlightenment only after years of stumbling through the darkness of spiritual doubt. He encouraged his followers to meditate in the darkness of caves, many of which are considered sacred sites even to this day. It was in a cave just outside the city of Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad is said to have encountered the angel Gabriel, who gave him the first words of Islam's holy book, the Quran. The Hindu religion of India tells us that the same sky that illuminates us in the day stretches out into cool infinite darkness in the night. As the sky is, so are we, both light and dark in one. If there is a single thing that makes me feel some spiritual connection with the universe, or something larger than myself, it is looking up at the night sky on a clear, moonless night. I can't think of anything more beautiful. And I would never be able to see any of that majesty without the darkness. It is the darkness that allows me to see all those impossibly distant lights, feeling wonder at the inconceivable size and beauty of this small corner of the galaxy. The famous Unitarian minister and writer Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his essay Nature, did a little thought experiment. He asked his readers to imagine if our planet had more than one sun, so that night came not once a day, but only once every 100 years. Imagine, he says, the delight, the awe, and the wonder that would attend the eclipse of binary stars and the astonishing appearance of those millions of stars. How people might fall to their knees and worship or turn their telescopes to study those stars. Of course, we don't have to imagine. But it is only the darkness that allows us to appreciate these cosmic lights. As it is in nature, so too it is sometimes true in life. To appreciate the light, you must also experience the dark. Learning to walk through the darkness of our lives is not easy. In fact, it can be challenging, if not downright scary at times. But if we allow ourselves to do it, we realize we can learn lessons from the dark that we could never learn if we focused only upon the light. It is almost like trying to live only in daylight. The darkness still comes every night, and it passes. If we try to live only in the light, then aren't we living only half a life? Something to think about on this eve of the winter solstice. May it be so.